Hello and welcome back to another episode of Nick Tiffany's Movie Reviews in the podcast form. Today we are coming at you with January's other huge box office savior, and that would be M3GAN, or M3GAN, depending on how you look at it. It is technically M3GAN, but she is the robotic, almost AI childhood doll, who's essentially meant to help a robotics toy company. But of course, an AI robot doll who only wants to protect can probably go some bad ways too. And of course, that's where our story starts. Now, M3GAN falls into the Blumhouse pantheon of all of their horror movies. This marks another collaboration with James Wan, famous for The Conjuring and Insidious sagas. Malignant was done by James Wan a couple years ago, and writer Kayla Cooper, who had also written that, joins James Wan again to write this story. M3GAN is kind of what I expected it to be, a little bit more sometimes, and more what I had hoped for, but largely still kind of left me wanting a bit more. It's a PG-13 horror thriller film, so I kind of knew going into it that, it could be fun, maybe have a couple exciting moments, but I wasn't expecting anything so over the top and either violent or gory that it was like, oh my god. M3GAN got kind of a cult following on Twitter. It's interestingly been championed heavily by the LGBTQ community. Community. The LGBTQ committee gives M3GAN a thumbs up. They did. But M3GAN, it's kind of campy. It's kind of funny in some parts. It is sometimes a little style over substance. But there was actually more of a story, fortunately, as well, to this film. Young Katie, played by Violet McGraw, who has been a young girl in pretty much every movie, and she's done great. I really enjoyed her in The Haunting of Hill House. She played the young version of Nellie. She was terrific. She was in Dr. Sleep. She was also in Black Widow. Really, really great child actor of the times. So Katie loses both her parents in a horrible accident, a head-on collision at the beginning of the film. And, the first glimpse that we really get of her is she's playing with almost like a Furby-like doll that you're supposed to feed, and then it poops, and then it tells you it's full. But it evolves, and it kind of marks where we're almost at with toys these days. Getting smarter, or whether it's the chat GP or all these different AI chat groups. But these toys are, somewhat advancing as time goes on. And so it's easy for a child to get kind of wrapped up in playing with them. But even then, Katie also loses the toy in that accident. So Katie goes on to live with her Aunt Gemma, played by Allison Williams, daughter of Brian Williams, though, who many know from Get Out as the horrible girlfriend Rose. But you might have also seen her in Girls, the Lena Dunham TV show. But she's a designer of sorts. She does all sorts of tech designing for this company that makes the Furbies, And part of what she is set to do is create the next generation of those toys, whether it's cheaper to compete with all the new, cheaper knockoffs in the market, or come up with something revolutionary that would change the toy robot game completely. So we kind of find out that Gemma is behind the scenes working on a sort of robotic companion of sorts, codenamed M3GAN. It's not really what her boss, David, played by Ronnie Ching, wants, but she's determined. She thinks that there's something there. She thinks it's what can take their company to the next level. But, of course, it doesn't totally go her way. And then when she's actually forced to kind of parent Katie, obviously being an aunt, she's no children here, doesn't totally know what she's getting into or how to help. But Katie takes an interest in the tech that she's working on, especially that of this almost humanoid robot that Gemma had created some years back. But just something that could be a companion for Katie, something that would talk with her and spend the time that maybe Gemma couldn't. So herein lies, again, there's a huge overlapping theme in this film, which is kind of prevalent, I feel like, with a lot of parents these days, or people. And that's the fact that, children are just handed technology at such a young age that they're either not getting taught, they're not getting the valuable human connection that they probably need to develop better. And we know we pass along responsibility to a screen of sorts. So Gemma has the bright idea of saying, hey, you know what? Maybe I can work on this prototype, M3GAN, and, I can kind of program her to help Katie to grow and to understand and to just be a friend, someone who will listen. And at first, that's all M3GAN was. She almost looks like a real girl. It's only up close that you can kind of tell something's up with her eyes and the way they kind of like twitch at you a little bit. It's a little unsettling, actually. But M3GAN's great. And surprisingly, and this is again where sometimes the best horror is really emotional, and it comes from really emotional places, like the Hill House series and those that Mike Flanagan has done over at Netflix. And M3GAN really becomes almost like a therapist for Katie, and almost instrumental in being able to help her handle and process her grief, and listening to her about it, and helping store, memories for her that are kind of told out loud. And to everybody's surprise, M3GAN is more than just a doll. She's really a friend. And really helping Gemma out here in the sense that, hey, you're almost getting parented by this robot. This is awesome, so Katie can turn off the robot and Gemma can turn off the robot. But the prime directive is to protect Katie and to protect her emotions. And that was kind of hardwired in from the beginning. And so obviously there might be a few flashes of time where, whether it's Katie getting bullied, Katie being scared and spoken to poorly by someone, where M3GAN cocks that head a little bit, and she mentions, you've made her cry. You've hurt Katie's feelings. I would apologize. Snappy little, I'm like, she's good with snappy little comments that kind of have you like, oh, what's M3GAN gonna do? But she doesn't do anything. It's not that kind of movie. Or is it? And, this is where I think I benefited from watching the unrated cut of M3GAN, which is, it's the exact same amount of time. It's the exact same length as the non-unrated version, which is kind of odd. And the only difference is that they've added a few more F words, and then, there's some blood and gore that's kind of ramped up from the original film, the PG-13 version. So I can't totally speak as to what happens in the PG-13 version. I think I got an idea of maybe where the line is drawn as far as the blood and gore go. But there were genuinely a few surprising moments in this film where M3GAN got a little more violent than I expected her to. And you kind of saw a few things that were almost like, oh my God, like, can she do that? Like, is that allowed? Can you hurt a kid like that? Or, and so surprisingly, there were really a few great, sometimes campy moments, where M3GAN's just kind of kicking ass and also like really hurting people. And it's pretty entertaining. And that's where I think this movie is probably at its best. Because it had that PG-13 rating, they weren't going to go overboard on the violence, but they were going to kind of make it campy and fun. It would still be more than enough to get like a nice like, reaction. But it's like a more enjoyable of a kill than anything. It's not so shocking. It's just kind of like an entertaining one. So in this unrated cut, I mean, truthfully, the amount of blood and gore there was I almost felt like they could have gotten away with that being a PG-13 cut. Truthfully, there's nothing so egregious that happens that I haven't seen before in a PG-13 film. But this just continues to further my own fuel of whether it's director's cuts and R-rated cuts or who the movie's made for. Obviously, M3GAN made a ton of money. And the benefit of making your horror film PG-13 is that it is accessible to so many people across the country. You could put a horror movie out any time of the year. Doesn't matter. People are going to go and see it. Teenagers will go and see a PG-13 horror movie, whether it's because they want to go in a group and they want to be scared, and you might get some snuggling going on at the movies. Or, parents, you need to drop your kids off at a movie because you want to go see something else. Great. I'm sure they'll be entertained enough. It's a great PG-13 option. And you guys can go catch the R flick. But it frustrates me sometimes because so many movies today exist, movies and TV shows exist in this in-between where it's like, all right, it's not quite TV mature, but it's not quite family friendly. There's moments where you're like, oh, this definitely is not for kids. And then there's moments where you're like, ooh, this is a little childish for a movie that's mostly serious. And I think it's just a really hard line that people are trying to walk these days, especially with everything on streaming services now. So many people watching at home, the idea of, okay, if you've got a family at home, as always, the movie's trying to reach the broadest audience. And I feel like now more than ever, we've really returned to studios, some of them really trying to play it safe, really trying to appeal to the broadest base. And that's worked pretty well, I'd say, for the most part. But I don't know. I think of what a rated R M3GAN could have been. Still telling a really emotional story at its core, and focusing on trauma and focusing on looking at what technology does to our relationships with kids, and our ability to process grief and understand the world as we grow up. And then you could also have some crazy awesome horror and thrills where the PG-13 version kind of cuts short on a couple kills and a couple moments where you're like, all right, obviously you're left to infer, and your mind can do a pretty good job of creating what could have happened to this character as they got killed or something like that. And this wasn't one of those moments where it's like, oh no, it's more powerful to really just think about what happens rather than to be shown it. Sometimes you do want to be shown it. That's what the horror genre has certainly revolved around and what works so well about it. So, M3GAN, I had a good time. It was definitely enjoyable to watch. It was a good rental. If you're going to rent it, I would watch the unrated version, because it does give it that kick up above, I think, than the PG-13 version would. And again, really, when you see unrated, it's not even going from R to unrated. So it's nothing so drastic or so crazy that you can expect the most gory, filthy film ever or anything like that. But another solid entry into the 2023 realm of films. Again, a great way to kick off a pretty mild month that is always January. Streaming on Peacock. For those two of you who have Peacock out there, I thought it was going to be on Paramount, and I barely have Paramount for Yellowstone and all the stuff in the Taylor Sheridan world. But for a $5 rental, M3GAN's a good time. And of course, there's going to be a M3GAN 2. Of course, when it makes as much money as it does on such a small budget, that's what you do with horror. That's how we got 5 to 6 Paranormal Activities. So see M3GAN now while you can, because you're going to be seeing more of her in the future. Thanks again for listening, guys. We'll catch you next time.